Part 4 on the Chapter 2 discussion of world history. Now we're on the broader influence of Mesopotamian society. And I'm going to start with the Hebrews. The Hebrews are people that speak the Hebrew language. The Israelites are Hebrew speakers who settled in Palestine, and the Jews are descendants of Hebrew speakers from Judea. It's interesting that they really didn't become monotheistic until Moses. In fact, if you look at what the history books say, they didn't really even become monotheistic, at least not doubling down on it, until Babylonian captivity. But I'm going to give you a little bit of Bible history here, and then we can see what you think, and I'm going to go over to the map to do it. So the Holy Land, of course, is right here in Israel. By the way, just so you know, I think it goes without saying, you figured I'm pretty liberal, and that includes that I am not a fan of the genocide going on right now. Yes, I do like Israel, but I do not like that they're killing all the Palestinians and basically committing an absolute ethnic cleansing genocide over there right now. Not a fan of that at all. That being said, I don't have any problem with Jewish people or Christians or any of that. I have a problem with murder. That's the issue. The issue is murder and genocide is wrong. But okay, that's modern stuff. Let's talk about the ancient stuff. So Abraham, the founder of the faith, probably came from around Sumeria, somewhere in southern Iraq, about 2000 BCE or so. And then he heard the voice of God and migrated over to Israel. Had all these descendants, Isaac and Jacob. Jacob had the 12 sons, which were the 12 tribes of Israel. Israel became Jacob's name because it means he wrestled with God. And then, of those 12, Joseph is sent over to Egypt. We're still in the book of Genesis, to get food when there's this big famine. But he stays, and several generations stay in Egypt. And then around 1400s BCE, Moses is the basket case in the Nile River, just like the basket case of Sargon of Akkad almost 1,000 years later in the Euphrates River. So Moses hears the voice of God in the burning bush, and he leads his people out of slavery in Egypt, and they cross the Red Sea. And well, you know the story of 40 years in the desert. Finally, supposedly the Exodus happened around 1446 BCE, and then Joshua conquers the Holy Land around 1406 BC. These details are not in the textbook. I went through an Old Testament Bible study one time and learned all this history. And basically in Joshua, the Holy Land is mostly conquered. And then in the book of Judges, Judges is what the tribal peoples of Israel called their local leaders. People get a little soft and they start intermarrying with the people and worshiping their pagan gods. And so the real God gets mad and he starts punishing them. And this goes on for about 300 years until finally, the Israelites decide, hey, we want to be like the surrounding peoples. We want a king. And God says, you don't want a king. I'll tell what my dad always said about kings. And hey, I'm a big fan of the No Kings protest. We're back over in the United States. I used to ask my dad, well, how come we don't have a king in the United States? Well, now we do. His name is Donald Trump. I'm joking. I don't think Trump's going to be a king, but he's sure abusing his powers. But that's a whole different story. But you know what my dad would always say? The reason we don't have a king is because even though there's nothing better than a good king, there's nothing worse than a bad king. And we don't want to take that risk over here. Well, basically, God said something along those same lines to the Hebrew people when they wanted a king 3,000 years ago, and he said, like, yeah, be careful what you wish for, be careful what you wish for, because the king's going to get corrupt, and he's going to take your money. Anyway, but they get King Saul, and then at their height, 1000 BCE to 930 BCE, they have King David, who does a lot of conquering, and he's not able to build the temple because God says, well, you killed so many people in your reign, even if it was for the good. God approved this killing. It was genocide to build up their kingdom, that we're going to let your son Solomon, your successor, build the temple. So Solomon builds the temple, and that gets us up to 930 BCE. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is during the age of Bronze Age collapse. Egypt's gone into decline pretty much post 1100 BC, 100 years earlier, around 1200 BC. The Hittites went into decline. Nobody's really powerful over here. Assyria doesn't come to power until a couple hundred years later. Hold that thought. They're going to be a major problem for the Israelites. But basically, the era of kings is this real intermediate period in this era after the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE and before the rise of the next big power, the Assyrians, around 800 BC. So it's like 1000 to about 930 BC, you got the great kings in Israel. And then things start going downhill. 922 BCE, the kingdom splits with Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And then 722 BCE, now the Assyrians are powerful. The Assyrians come in and they wipe out the northern group, the 10 tribes of Israel, and these are the lost tribes of Israel. They basically get absorbed into the Assyrian Empire and vanish from history. But Judah hangs on in the south, and according to the Bible, that's because Judah's more obedient to God and isn't following pagan gods. And so then the Assyrians collapse, like I say, basically from internal rebellions and their own brutality in about 612 BCE. And then Babylon reasserts itself with the Chaldean dynasty, and Nebuchadnezzar comes to power in 605 BCE. And then in 586 BCE, the Babylonians capture the Jewish people from Judah. And now the Holy Land's wiped off the map, and the Jews are in Babylonian captivity for 70 years. But here's where it gets interesting. Of course, that story does have a happy ending, happy-ish, when Iran, Persia, Cyrus the Great comes to power. 539 BC, conquers Babylon, and then in 516 BC, I believe that's under Darius, the Jews are sent back to Israel to rebuild their temple, and you get the rest of the story. We'll get to that in other parts of the chapter. I'm going to get to that next, the Jewish diaspora. But first, unlike the Assyrians and the 10 lost tribes over 100 years earlier, who basically lose their identity, assimilate, and become Assyrians themselves, because that was part of Ashurbanipal and other Assyrians' leaders' strategy was scatter the conquered people all over the land. But the Babylonians, in Babylonian captivity, the Jewish people actually doubled down on their religion. And going back to what actually happened here, actual archaeology doesn't quite show as colorful a history of the Holy Land as the one I just told you, which is based on the Old Testament Bible. But, in other words, they didn't conquer all of Palestine, and they actually intermingled with a lot of the people in there, which the Bible itself says they did, and then the Bible says that God was angry about it. But in the last couple of hundred years after the kingdom split in the 900s BC, up to the conquests of 722 BC by the Assyrians and 586 BC by the Babylonians, there were all these prophets sent to the Holy Land basically to warn the people and say, hey, if you don't turn back to God, if you don't stop worshiping your pagan gods and living in sin, God's going to send these conquerors that are going to take you and humiliate you and defeat you. And then when that happened with the Assyrian and Babylonian conquest, it was like, oh my gosh, the prophets were right. The prophecies came true. So in Babylonian captivity, most of the Hebrew Bible, Christian Old Testament, was written basically in the 500s and 400s BCE. And that was when there was this big, let's turn back to God. And according to the Bible itself, God rewarded them by sending the Persians in to free the Jews and send them back to Jerusalem to rebuild their temple. That being said, that was 2,500 years ago, and the beginning of an event that is still going on today called the Jewish diaspora. A diaspora is when one group of people sees more of their members of that group in other parts of the world than their homeland. So yes, Israel, Palestine, this is the Holy Land. But to this day, the great majority of Jewish people live in other parts of the world. Think New York City, Miami, Florida, Charleston, South Carolina for a local one, etc. Way more live around the world in scattered communities than live in Israel. And even in the time of Jesus, 500 years after the Persians and the rebuilt the temple, that was true. More Jewish people lived in Egypt and Iraq and other areas than in Palestine. But anyway, that's the story of the Hebrews for you and early Jewish history. Pretty cool stuff. Well, at the same time that this was going on, you had another group to the north in what is now Lebanon, and that was the Phoenicians. They are best known for the alphabet. We're talking about cuneiform writing in about 3000 BCE, 3200 BC, and it lasted about 3,000 years. But around 1500 BC, the Phoenicians came up with 22 letters, 22 consonants, no vowels yet. By 800 BC, the Greeks took this alphabet and they added the vowels to it. And then later, maybe around the time of Christ, the Romans took the alphabet and they made it the alphabet that we use today, 26 letters. There were thousands of cuneiform characters and it took years and years and years to learn, so not that many people were literate or able to read and write due to how many thousands of characters there were. But the alphabet simplified writing. Interestingly enough, when we get into our fourth and final river valley civilization, the Yellow River of China, Chinese writing on oracle bones from 4,000 years ago, it's still around today. Modern Chinese is still thousands of characters, but most of the world uses the alphabet of about 26 letters, which was started by the Phoenicians in modern-day Lebanon. They also traded cedar. One of the editions I have of Traditions and Encounters has King Hiram trading with the Israelites in cedar. But the biggest thing to know about the Phoenicians is that they were not like the Egyptians or the Hittites or the Assyrians. They did not have a big land-based empire. They ruled from city-states, but their main method of transportation was on the seas. They were awesome shipbuilders, used their cedar logs to build ships and to go all over the Mediterranean and dominate this area. When we get into Roman history, that won't be till chapter 11, we'll talk about the Carthaginians from modern-day Tunisia, and that's where you get to the story of Hannibal and his march with the elephants in the Second Punic War. I'm getting way ahead of myself. The Carthaginians are wiped off the map by the Romans in the Punic Wars, but they're basically descendants of the Phoenicians from hundreds of years earlier, and the Phoenicians are some of the best seafarers of the time. Not only do they dominate the Mediterranean, but they even get out into the Atlantic, and some of them get as far north as up in England, and some of them get as far south as the Canary Islands and even the Gulf of Guinea in West Africa. So, I mean, the Phoenicians get all the way out here, all through the Mediterranean. They're massive traders. I'm going to show you the map in the book, but it's pretty amazing. And like I say, I mentioned that the Israelites, Saul, David, and Solomon, were at their height around 1000 BCE. So are the Phoenicians, 1200 to 800 BCE. No coincidence. It was after the Bronze Age collapse when the Hittites in Egypt were gone and before the rise of the Assyrians becoming super powerful. So this kind of land between the empires and the era between the empires has this 400-year run of being real powerful. Sorry I'm losing my voice, but I'm going to go to the map in the book next. And you can see Israel in the north, Judah in the south, but in the way north, that's Phoenicia. And those purple lines are the Phoenician trade routes, and they went all over the Mediterranean, like I say, into the Atlantic as far north as England, and as far south as the Gulf of Guinea in West Africa. Pretty amazing. So we got all these subgroups too. And then we'll talk about the last one, which I already really talked about earlier. I think it was part 2 of this 5-part series. I talked about the Indo-European language groups. spread all the languages coming from southern Russia. I showed you on the modern map. Here's the ancient map with dates and how they spread down to Anatolia as the Hittites. That was the first Indo-European group in this area. Spread down to Iran, India. One group even went to what's now Xinjiang, Kashgar, China, and that's believed the Uyghur people are descendants of that group, and that's why they almost look white. And that was 2000 BCE. And then Greece and Rome and all over Europe, Indo-European languages spread. So there's your map for you. And this took place over thousands of years as a gradual process. That's the Phoenician alphabet that we were talking about. But here are the Indo-European languages, just a few of them, and how many of the words are so similar. You can really see that, which is super cool. The Indo-Europeans were the beginning of the theme you're going to see in a lot of our river valley civilizations, because they weren't the only ones doing it. And that is civilizations down here versus horse nomads up here. So now I'm going to go back to the other map and talk. And basically you have this whole area from like Hungary and this area all the way to Mongolia. Most of this is cold, grassy steppe land. You didn't really have empires back in the day. You had nomads on horseback. But you had empires in here from China to India to Iran to Mesopotamia and Anatolia. And so all these people on their horseback would come in and they would wipe out civilizations, or they would try to. The climax of this is not till the 1200s CE, when the Mongols basically make the biggest empire the world has ever seen, conquering most of the Eastern Hemisphere. But Indo-Europeans were one of those horseback nomadic groups of people. Although most of Europe at this time was pretty much nomadic. The only major civilizations in Europe, and we're going to get to this in a few chapters down the road, would be Greece and Rome. But when Rome would expand right before the time of Christ, think era of Julius Caesar, like maybe 50 BCE, and get into like Spain and France and all that, they encountered a lot of nomads and conquered those civilizations. And eventually Rome later would kind of be the seeds of European history. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. But anyway, those were kind of the other groups outside of the Mesopotamian civilizations. You had, like I say, the Indo-European migrants with the Hittites right here being the closest here, the Persians here. And then you had the Israelites, which were Semitic, of course, and also the Phoenicians, also Semitic in their domination of the Mediterranean. So a lot of cool stuff. And I think that about covers chapter 2 of world history. The last video I'm going to do is going to be a quick summary using maps and timeline visuals, and then we'll move on to Egypt. Woohoo!